The question hangs in the air even after all these years. It's a ghost that haunts Finnish memory. Did a copycat commit the Lake Bodom murders? It's a simple question with a tangled, messy answer. To even begin to understand it, you have to go back to a cold, misty morning in June 1960. You have to go back to a tent by a lake. Lake Bodom is a pretty place. It's in Espoo, not far from Helsinki. In the summer, people go there to swim, to fish, to camp. It's peaceful. But on June 5th, 1960, it was the opposite of peaceful. There were two boys walking by the lake, saw something wrong. A tent collapsed and torn. A man lying on the ground outside it, his blonde hair matted with blood. They knew something terrible had happened. They ran for help. When the police arrived, they found a scene of pure chaos. The tent was slashed to ribbons. Inside, they found the bodies of two teenage girls, Mila Ermeli Bjorklund and Anja Tuulikki-Maki. Both were 15 years old. They had been stabbed and bludgeoned. Outside the tent, near the blonde man, was the body of another teenager, Seppo Antero Boisman, who was 18. He had suffered similar brutal injuries. The blonde man was also 18. His name was Nils Gustafsson, and against all odds, he was still alive. Nils was badly hurt. He had a concussion, fractures to his jaw and face, and stab wound. He was in shock. He had no memory of the attack, or at least that's what he said. The police had one survivor, one witness, but he couldn't tell them what happened. He said he saw a glimpse of an attacker, a figure dressed in black with bright red eyes, coming at them. It sounded like a phantom, something from a nightmare. It wasn't much to go on. The investigation started badly and got worse. The crime scene was a mess. The police were not equipped for something like this. Onlookers and even some officers trampled all over the area, destroying potential evidence. So, they didn't even properly rope it off. They called in soldiers to help search the woods and the lake for the murder weapons, but they were never found. As a knife and some kind of blunt instrument were used, but they vanished. A few key items were also missing from the campsite. Some money, some small personal items, and crucially, the keys to Seppo's motorcycle. The motorcycle itself was still there, and Nils Gustafsson's shoes were found about 500 meters away from the tent, partially hidden. The killer had taken them and maybe wore them for a short distance before discarding them. Why? It was just one of many bizarre details that made no sense. Who would do this? Who would attack 4 sleeping teenagers in a tent? The motive seemed to be absent. It wasn't just a robbery. The violence was too extreme, too personal. It felt like rage. The police were stumped. They looked at everyone. They questioned hundreds, then thousands of people. And a few names started to stick out. There was a man who ran a small kiosk near the lake. His name was Carl Valdemar Gillstrom. People called him the Kiosk Man. He was known to have a temper. And he hated campers. He would yell at them, cut their tent ropes, throw rocks at them. He was a local eccentric, a known troublemaker. The night of the murders, some people said they saw him leaving the area. Later, his wife told a neighbor that her husband had confessed to the murders before he died by suicide in 1969. He told her, "I did it." He even filled in the well on his property shortly after the killings, leading people to believe he had hidden the murder weapons and bloody clothes there. But the police had questioned Gillstrom back in 1960. He had an alibi. His wife said he was home with her. She later recanted, saying he had threatened her to keep quiet, but by then it was too late. He was dead, and digging up his well decades later revealed nothing. The Kiosk Man theory was a dead end. There were others, a man named Pauli Luoma, who had escaped from a nearby work prison. He fit the description of a man seen leaving the area, but he had a rock-solid alibi. He was in another town miles away at the time of the murders. There was Pentti Soininen, a career criminal who confessed to the murders while in prison for other crimes. But his story was inconsistent, and he was known to be a pathological liar. His confession was dismissed. The police were chasing ghosts. The case went cold. For decades, it was Finland's greatest mystery. A story told around campfires. A national trauma. The killer of Lake Bodom was a boogeyman, an unknown monster who came in the night. And this is where the copycat idea finally comes into focus, because the Lake Bodom murders were not the first of their kind. Just a year earlier, in 1959, another horrific crime had shocked Finland. It was called the Tulilahti murders. 2 young women, Aine Nissinen and Rita Pakanen, went camping by a lake. They were found a few weeks later, murdered. They had been killed in their tent. The scene was brutal. The parallels to Bodom were impossible to ignore. 2 separate incidents, a year apart, with a terrifyingly similar setup: young people, camping by a lake, attacked and killed in their tent. Could the Bodom killer have been inspired by the Tulilahti murders? Was he trying to recreate that horror? Or was there an even more disturbing possibility? What if the same person committed both crimes? This is the heart of the copycat theory, which is really a serial killer theory in disguise. And it centers on one man. A man so strange, so out of place, that he almost feels like a character from a spy novel. His name was Hans Assmann. Hans Assmann was a German who lived in Finland. He was rumored to be a former SS officer and a possible KGB spy. He was a shadowy figure. People who knew him said he was intelligent, but also unstable and violent. And he kept popping up on the fringes of Finland's most notorious crimes. After the Bodom murders, a man matching Assmann's description showed up at a Helsinki hospital. His clothes were dirty and stained with what looked like blood. He was nervous and aggressive. He even cut his own fingernails to get rid of the dirt underneath them. The doctors and nurses were suspicious. One of the doctors, Jorma Palo, later became convinced that this patient was the Bodom killer. He wrote books about it, pushing the theory that Assmann was the man. The connection gets deeper. The police actually questioned Assmann about the Bodom murders, but he had an alibi. A supposedly solid alibi. He said he was at home with his wife. The police accepted it and let him go. But years later, his wife would say that wasn't true. She said Hans was out all night and came home the next morning with his clothes torn and dirty. She said she was afraid of him, so she lied to the police. And what about the Tuulalahti murders a year earlier? Assmann lived relatively close to that crime scene as well. He fit the general description of a man seen in the area. The killer in that case was never found either. Could Assmann be the link? A predator who targeted campers? The idea was compelling. It explained the randomness, the brutality. It tied two of Finland's worst unsolved crimes together with a single, sinister thread. There was more. A former police officer claimed that Assmann, near the end of his life, confessed to a number of crimes, including Bodom. The story goes that Assmann, old and sick, told the officer something along the lines of, "It's one of those things you just do and forget." It wasn't a direct, detailed confession, but it was chilling. So the theory is this: Hans Assmann, a secretive and violent man, perhaps a spy with training in covert operations, was the killer. He had killed before at Tuulalahti. He found a new set of victims at Lake Bodom and repeated his crime. A copycat of his own work, in a sense. He used his intelligence and perhaps his connections to create a plausible alibi, and he got away with it. The police, maybe pressured by powerful people who wanted to protect Assmann for political reasons, let him slip through their fingers. You know, it's a neat theory, it explains a lot, it gives a face to the boogeyman, but here's the problem. It's all circumstantial. Every piece of evidence linking Assmann to the crime is a he said, she said story. It's based on sightings that can't be confirmed, a hospital visit that was suspicious but not conclusive, and confessions that were either vague or came secondhand after Assmann was dead. The police did look at him. They didn't just ignore him. They must have had a reason to clear him. Maybe his alibi was stronger than his ex-wife later claimed. Maybe the evidence at the hospital wasn't as damning as the story suggests. Without hard proof, Hans Assmann is just another suspect. A very interesting suspect, but a suspect nonetheless. The Lake Bodom story could have ended there. A cold case with a few compelling theories, doomed to be debated forever. But then in 2004, everything changed. The Finnish police held a press conference. They announced they had solved the Lake Bodom murders. After 44 years, they had their man. And their man was Nils Gustafsson, the lone survivor, the boy who saw the monster with red eyes. The police now believed he had made it all up. Their new theory was that there was no outside attacker. The killer had been inside the tent all along. They claimed that a fight had broken out among the teenagers, likely fueled by jealousy. Seppo and Nils were both interested in Mila, the most popular girl in the group. The police proposed that Nils, in a fit of drunken rage after being rejected by Mila, snapped. He attacked and killed Seppo and the two girls. His own injuries, they claimed, were either self-inflicted to create a cover story or sustained in the fight with Seppo, but were far less severe than the victims. What was the new evidence that led them to this conclusion after 4 decades? DNA. Technology had advanced. They re-examined the items from the crime scene. They tested Nils Gustafsson's shoes, the ones found 500 meters from the tent. They found blood from all 3 victims on the shoes, but they also found Nils' DNA on the outside of the shoes. The prosecution argued this meant Nils had been wearing the shoes, got the victim's blood on them during the attack, and then took them off and tried to hide them. They also pointed to a witness statement from a woman who had been birdwatching nearby. She said she saw the tent collapse around 4 a.m. and saw a blonde man leaving the scene shortly after. For years, this was thought to be a sighting of the killer, but the police now argued that the blonde man was Nils Gustafsson, leaving the scene of his own crime to hide his shoes. The entire country of Finland was in shock. Could the man everyone had pitied for 44 years actually be the killer? It seemed unbelievable. Nils Gustafsson, now in his 60s, was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder. His trial began in 2005. The prosecution laid out their case. The motive was jealousy. The opportunity was there. The new DNA evidence, they said, put him at the scene not as a victim, but as the perpetrator. They tried to paint a picture of a teenage argument that spiraled into unimaginable violence. They suggested that Nils's memory loss was a convenient lie he had maintained for his entire adult life. But the defense had a very different story to tell. They methodically took apart the prosecution's case piece by piece. First, the motive. There was no real evidence of a serious fight or jealousy. First, they were just teenagers on a camping trip. Friends who knew them said there was no major conflict between them. The jealousy angle was pure speculation. Second, the injuries. The defense brought in medical experts who testified that Nils Gustafsson's injuries were severe and life-threatening. A broken jaw, multiple facial fractures, stab wounds. These were not injuries you could easily inflict on yourself. And they were certainly not injuries that would allow you to brutally murder 3 other people, 2 of whom were strong young men, and then walk 500 meters to hide your shoes. The idea that he was barely hurt was a fantasy. He was nearly the 4th victim. Third, the DNA evidence. The defense pointed out how weak it really was. Finding the victim's blood on Nils's shoes wasn't surprising. There was a bloodbath, blood would have been everywhere, and finding Nils's DNA on his own shoes, that proved nothing at all. He wore them. What was more interesting was the DNA they didn't find. They tested the tent and other items for outside DNA, and they found some. DNA that did not belong to any of the 4 teenagers, but they couldn't match to anyone. This pointed strongly to an unknown person at the scene, an outside attacker. And finally, the witness, the birdwatcher who saw a blonde man. Yes, Nils was blonde, but Seppo, one of the victims, was also blonde, and the description was vague. More importantly, 2 other young boys who were fishing nearby that morning gave a much more compelling statement back in 1960. They said they saw the tent from a distance, and they saw a man with long blonde hair walking away from it, a man they did not recognize. Their testimony supported the idea of an outside killer from the very beginning. The trial was a sensation. In the end, the court sided with the defense. The evidence against Nils Gustafsson was too weak, too circumstantial. The prosecution's theory had too many holes. In October 2005, Nils Gustafsson was acquitted of all charges. The court stated that the prosecution had failed to prove he was the killer. He was a free man. The state even paid him compensation for the mental anguish caused by the long suspicion and trial. So, the case was back to square one. If Nils didn't do it, then who did? The acquittal of Nils Gustafsson reopened the door to all the old theories. The kiosk man, the escaped prisoner, and of course the shadowy figure of Hans Assmann. The acquittal meant that there was an outside attacker. The original theory was correct all along. This brings us back to the central question. Was it a copycat? The acquittal of Nils makes the Assmann theory seem more plausible again. If an unknown person attacked the tent, then a man like Assmann, who was suspected in a similar tent murder a year before, becomes a prime candidate. The similarities between the two Lake Bodom murders are the strongest argument for this. Both involved attacks on campers and tents. Both were incredibly violent. Both were left unsolved. It's hard to dismiss that as a pure coincidence, but we have to be careful with the term copycat. A copycat crime usually means a crime committed by someone who is deliberately mimicking another, often more famous, crime. They are inspired by the details they read in the news. It's possible the Bodom killer read about Tuulalahti and got the idea from there, but there's no evidence for that. It's pure speculation. The more likely scenario, if the 2 crimes are connected, is not that one was a copy of the other, but that they were committed by the same person. A serial offender with a specific method. This person targeted young people camping in isolated areas. They attacked them in their tents, a place where they were most vulnerable. If this is true, then Bodom wasn't a copycat crime, it was part of a series. Does this mean Hans Assmann was the killer? It's still the most compelling theory for an outside attacker. He fits the profile of a violent, disturbed individual. His alleged hospital visit is the single most bizarre and suspicious piece of witness testimony in the entire case. The potential failure of the police to properly investigate him, either through incompetence or for political reasons, would explain how a guilty man walked free. However, we can't ignore the problems with the Assmann theory. It remains unproven. It relies on decades-old memories, secondhand stories, and deathbed confessions that can't be verified. And Jorma Palo, the doctor who championed the theory, was convinced. But a doctor's conviction is not legal proof. The police in the 1960s had Assmann in their sights and let him go. We have to assume they had a good reason. Maybe his alibi really was unbreakable. Maybe they had evidence that cleared him, which has since been lost to time. There's another possibility, one that's less exciting but perhaps more realistic. The similarities between the Tuulalahti and Bodom murders could just be a coincidence. Finland has a lot of lakes and a strong camping culture. A tent is an obvious target for someone wanting to attack campers. The method of attack, stabbing, and bludgeoning is common in violent assaults. It's possible that two separate, disturbed individuals in two different parts of the country committed two similar terrible crimes. The world is full of random, senseless violence. We look for patterns because it helps us make sense of the chaos. Sometimes there is no pattern. So, did a copycat commit the Lake Bodom murders? The honest answer is that we will probably never know for sure. The term copycat itself is tricky. If you mean, did the killer get the idea from the Tuulalahti murders, it's possible but unprovable. If you mean, was it the same killer, making Bodom a continuation of his work, then it's one of the leading theories, and it points a shaky finger at Hans Assmann. But the story of Lake Bodom is a lesson in the limits of investigation. The original sin of the case was the contamination of the crime scene. That single failure in the first few hours made it almost impossible to solve. Evidence was lost forever. The trail went cold almost immediately. In the vacuum of hard evidence, theories and legends grew. The kiosk man, the spy, and finally, the survivor. Each theory offers a neat explanation, a tidy box to put the horror in. But reality is rarely so tidy. The trial of Nils Gustafsson was an attempt to finally close that box. The state tried to force an answer. They failed. His acquittal proved that after all those years, they still had nothing concrete. They had theories, but no proof. The Lake Bodom murders remain open, a wound in the Finnish psyche that has never healed. The story endures because it is a perfect mystery. It has a horrific and memorable crime, a cast of strange suspects, and a final twist that no one saw coming. The copycat theory, the Hans Assmann theory, is a huge part of that legend. It's a compelling narrative of a Cold War spy turned serial killer. It's a great story. But we have to remember that's what it is, a story, a theory. It is not a fact. The truth of what happened that night in June 1960 likely died with the killer. He or she got away with it. They lived their life and probably died of old age, taking their secret to the grave. All we are left with are the ghosts. The ghosts of 3 teenagers who went camping and never came home. And the ghost of a question that will likely never be answered. The monster with red eyes that Nils Gustafsson described might have been a hallucination born of trauma, but a real monster did visit Lake Bodom that night. We just never found out his name, and linking him to another crime a year earlier, while a tantalizing idea remains just that. An idea. A whisper in the dark woods surrounding a still and silent lake.